There are roughly 600 million domestic cats on Earth. They live on every continent except Antarctica, in apartments and farmhouses and back alleys, in the homes of people who feed them expensive food from small cans, and in the streets of cities where they feed themselves. They come in hundreds of coat patterns and dozens of recognized breeds, from the flat-faced Persian to the hairless Sphinx to the enormous Maine Coon. And every single one of them, every cat alive anywhere on Earth today, traces back to wild ancestors from one specific corner of the Middle East. The question of where domestic cats came from sounds like it should have an obvious answer. Cats are cats. They look like small wild cats. Pick any wild cat species and the resemblance is obvious. But when scientists actually ran the DNA comparison, collecting samples from domestic cats worldwide and testing them against every wild cat species they could find, the answer was not obvious at all. Most wild cats did not match. Species that seemed like logical candidates turned out to be genetically distant from the house cat. The comparison eliminated species after species before landing on the one that produced a clear result. The wild cat family contains around 37 living species. The big cats, lions, tigers, leopards, jaguars, snow leopards, are the most famous, but they represent only a small portion of the total diversity. The majority of wild cat species are small to medium-sized animals that most people outside of their home regions have never heard of. The fishing cat of Southeast Asian wetlands, the flat-headed cat of Borneo, the pampas cat of South America, the caracal of Africa and the Middle East, the ocelot, the serval, the Scottish wildcat, the jungle cat. Dozens of species spread across every continent except Antarctica and Australia. Researchers tested domestic cat DNA against this full range. The big cats were eliminated immediately. The genetic distance between a house cat and a lion is enormous, far too large to indicate anything other than very ancient shared ancestry. The South American cats, ocelots, margays, oncillas, pampas cats, were also eliminated. They form their own distinct group within the cat family that diverged from the house cat lineage millions of years ago. The Asian bay cat group, the caracal group, the serval, all eliminated. Some of the eliminations were surprising. The jungle cat, a medium-sized species that lives across South and Southeast Asia and was once thought to be a possible domestic cat ancestor, partly because of its historical association with ancient Egyptian sites, turned out to be too genetically distant from house cats to be the source. Ancient DNA from cat remains found at Egyptian archaeological sites confirmed that the cats living alongside Egyptians were not jungle cats, but Near Eastern wildcats. The jungle cat had been present in Egypt, and Egyptians did occasionally tame individual jungle cats, but the house cat did not come from them. The Scottish wildcat, which is the last wildcat in Britain and one of the most endangered mammals in Europe, is technically the same species as the Near Eastern wildcat, Felis sylvestris, but a different subspecies. Genetic testing of Scottish wildcats showed they were distinct enough from the Near Eastern population and from domestic cats that they could not be the source of domestication. They had been separated from the Near Eastern wildcat population for long enough to develop their own genetic identity. The Scottish wildcat also showed evidence of extensive interbreeding with domestic cats in recent centuries, which has complicated conservation efforts. Many animals that look like Scottish wildcats carry significant domestic cat DNA. What the comparison was looking for was not just a resemblance or a general relationship. It was looking for the specific wildcat population whose DNA so closely matched domestic cats that the two could credibly be ancestor and descendant. That level of match requires a very recent split, an ancestor that walked the same landscape as modern humans and whose descendants eventually ended up living in human homes. The match was the Near Eastern wildcat, Felis sylvestris libica, a small, sandy-colored wildcat that lives across North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Middle East. When researchers compared the genomes of Near Eastern wildcats from the region stretching roughly from what is now Turkey through Syria, Iraq, and into the Iranian plateau, the genetic signature of domestic cats worldwide aligned almost perfectly with that specific population. The Near Eastern wildcat from the Fertile Crescent region was the ancestor, not the African wildcat further south in sub-Saharan Africa, though it is closely related. Not the European wildcat of Scotland and the Pyrenees, which has been completely separate from the domestic cat lineage for long enough to be genetically quite distinct. Not the Chinese mountain cat, which some researchers had proposed as a possible secondary source for Asian domestic cats. Specifically, the Near Eastern wildcat, from a specific part of the Middle East, at a specific moment in history. That moment was roughly 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago, the Fertile Crescent was where something new was happening in human history. People who had spent hundreds of thousands of years as nomadic hunter-gatherers were beginning to settle down and farm. They were cultivating wheat and barley, domesticating sheep and goats and cattle, building permanent villages. For the first time in human history, people were storing large quantities of grain in one place for extended periods of time. Grain stores attract mice. Mice attract wild cats. The Near Eastern wildcat, which had been hunting rodents in the scrublands and rocky hillsides around these settlements long before humans arrived, suddenly found itself with an extraordinary new food source. A dense, reliable population of rodents living right next to a human village. The cats that were bold enough to approach human settlements, that were comfortable enough around people to hunt in that environment, had a significant advantage over the more skittish cats that stayed away. They ate better. Their kittens survived at higher rates. Over generations, the cats living near human settlements became slightly less wild, slightly more tolerant of human presence, slightly better at reading human behavior. The Near Eastern wildcat is a skilled and patient hunter. It hunts primarily at dawn and dusk, stalking rodents through low vegetation using sight and hearing. It is solitary and territorial, and in the wild it is genuinely difficult to observe. It avoids human activity. What changed 10,000 years ago was not the cat's hunting ability or its basic personality. What changed was the math. A grain store in a village of 200 people might attract several hundred mice. Several hundred mice concentrated in a small area is a hunting environment that does not exist anywhere in the wild. The cats that discovered it had stumbled onto something unlike anything their species had encountered before. The researchers who reconstructed this history from the DNA were careful to emphasize that the process was not domestication in the traditional sense. Traditional domestication involves humans selecting individual animals for specific traits and breeding them deliberately. Dogs were domesticated through a process in which humans, over many generations, chose the wolves that were most useful and bred them selectively. Horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, all went through deliberate, human-driven selection that reshaped their bodies and behaviors over centuries. Cats went through none of that. Nobody chose which wild cats to breed. Nobody was selecting for tameness. The cats that ended up living near humans were simply the cats that were comfortable doing so, and their kittens inherited that comfort. Humans noticed. A cat that killed rats and mice in your grain store was a cat worth tolerating, maybe worth encouraging. People started leaving food out. Cats started coming closer. No one made a decision to domesticate cats the way they made a decision to breed wolves into herding dogs. It happened gradually, driven more by the cat's choices than by human intervention. The cat is the only major domesticated animal that chose the process itself. The DNA preserved the record of this founding event in precise detail. When researchers analyzed the mitochondrial DNA of domestic cats, the genetic material that passes unchanged from mother to kitten, they found that all domestic cats worldwide descended from just 5 founding females. Not 500, not 50. 5 individual wild cats living in the Fertile Crescent region whose descendants spread across the entire world over the following 10,000 years. 5 maternal lineages, 600 million cats. The math is staggering. Every cat that has ever purred on a human lap, every cat that has ever knocked an object off a table, every cat that has ever been photographed in a cardboard box, traces its maternal line back to one of 5 wild female cats that lived near early farming settlements in the Middle East 10 millennia ago. The 5 founding lineages left a signature in domestic cat DNA that is detectable worldwide. Cats in Japan, cats in Brazil, cats in Nigeria, cats in Norway, all carry genomes that trace back to those 5 Near Eastern wild cats. The signature has been slightly blurred by thousands of years of cats breeding with each other as populations mixed and moved, and in a small number of cases, by domestic cats interbreeding with local wild cats in regions where those wild cats existed. In parts of Europe, some domestic cats carry a small amount of European wildcat DNA, the result of occasional matings between feral domestic cats and wild European wildcats. In some parts of Africa, domestic cats carry traces of the African wildcat, but in every case, these are minor contributions to a genome that is fundamentally and overwhelmingly Near Eastern in origin. The founding event happened only once. This was one of the key findings of the DNA comparison, and it was not guaranteed to be true. Researchers going into the study considered the possibility that cats had been domesticated independently in multiple places, that people in China had domesticated the Chinese mountain cat separately, that Egyptians had domesticated their local wildcat independently of whatever was happening in the Fertile Crescent. The genome comparison ruled that out. Every domestic cat on Earth, regardless of where it lives today, carries the genetic fingerprint of that single domestication event in the Fertile Crescent. If cats had been domesticated a second time somewhere else, that secondary population would carry a different genetic baseline, and no such baseline exists anywhere in the current domestic cat population. The spread from that founding population happened in waves. The first wave was slow, cats moving with human agricultural communities as farming spread westward from the Fertile Crescent into Europe and eastward into Asia over thousands of years. The second wave was faster, and it was driven by ships. Sailors discovered early that cats were extraordinarily useful on boats, keeping the rodent population in check in cargo holds full of grain and rope and food supplies. Cats went wherever ships went. By the time of the Roman Empire, domestic cats had reached Britain. By the medieval period, they were in Scandinavia. Within a few centuries of the first oceanic voyages, cats were in the Americas, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Australia. Ancient Egypt played a specific role in this story, and the DNA helped clarify exactly what that role was. Egypt did not domesticate cats. The DNA is clear on that point. By the time Egyptian civilization began developing, cats had already been living with farming communities in the Fertile Crescent for thousands of years. What Egypt did was amplify. Egyptians elevated cats to a cultural and religious status unlike anything in the ancient world. Cats were associated with the goddess Bastet. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was a serious crime. Millions of cats were mummified as religious offerings. Entire cat cemeteries have been excavated in Egypt, containing hundreds of thousands of preserved animals. That cultural elevation had a genetic consequence. Egyptian cats were traded, gifted, and transported across the ancient Mediterranean world as valuable and sacred animals. When researchers compared ancient cat DNA from archaeological sites across Europe and North Africa, they found a distinct Egyptian genetic signature spreading westward through the ancient world starting around 1500 BCE. A wave of cat dispersal driven by trade and cultural exchange, overlapping with the earlier, slower wave of agricultural spread. The house cat's global population carries the genetic legacy of both waves. One of the most striking pieces of evidence for the early relationship between humans and cats came not from genetics, but from archaeology, though it was genetic analysis that confirmed its significance. In 2004, on the island of Cyprus, researchers excavating a 9,500-year-old burial site found a human skeleton buried alongside a cat. The cat had been placed with clear intentionality, positioned close to the human, in what appeared to be a deliberate burial arrangement. Cyprus has no native wild cat population. The only way a cat could have been on Cyprus 9,500 years ago was if humans had brought it there by boat. The burial suggests that by that point, the relationship between humans and cats was already close enough that someone considered their cat worth burying with them. The DNA analysis of the Cyprus cat confirmed it was a Near Eastern wild cat, consistent with the Fertile Crescent origin the genome studies identified. It was not yet a domestic cat in the full sense. The genetic changes associated with domestication had not yet accumulated to the degree seen in modern house cats. But it was a cat that had been living closely enough with people that someone carried it across open water. What those genetic changes associated with domestication actually look like is one of the more interesting results of the genome comparison. The house cat genome is strikingly similar to the Near Eastern wildcat genome. Most of the domestic cat's DNA is essentially unchanged from its wild ancestor. The physical differences between a house cat and a Near Eastern wildcat are minor. Coat color variations, slight size differences, subtle changes in skull shape. Nothing like the dramatic physical transformation that separates a Great Dane from a wolf or a domestic pig from a wild boar. The changes that did accumulate were concentrated in specific areas. Genes associated with fear responses and aggression showed modification. The domestic cat is less reactive to unfamiliar stimuli than its wild ancestor, more willing to approach rather than flee. Genes associated with the brain's reward system changed. Domestic cats show stronger responses to social reward, meaning that interaction with humans triggers positive signals in the cat brain in a way it would not in a wild cat. Memory-related genes also changed, in ways that may make domestic cats better at learning associations between human behavior and outcomes like food. The physical genome barely changed. The behavioral genome shifted just enough to make coexistence with humans possible and, eventually, appealing. The house cat is not a transformed wild animal in the way that a dog is a transformed wolf. It is a wild animal with a slightly adjusted tolerance for human company and a slightly stronger tendency to find that company rewarding. The comparison also revealed something about cat breeds that surprised the researchers. Modern cat breeds, Siamese, Persian, Maine Coon, Bengal, Russian Blue, are largely recent creations. Most recognized breeds were developed in the 19th and early 20th centuries through deliberate selective breeding, which is recent in evolutionary terms. The DNA of even the most selectively bred modern cat still shows the overwhelming Near Eastern wildcat baseline underneath the breed-specific variations. Thousands of years of living with humans and a century of formal breed development have not moved the cat genome very far from where it started. The breed differences visible in coat color, body shape, and head structure sit on top of a genome that is, underneath, essentially the same animal that walked into a Neolithic grain store 10 millennia ago. That is probably why cats retain so much of their wild behavior. A cat that has been living in a house for 10 years will still stalk and hunt anything that moves, still defend territory, still communicate largely through the same signals a wild cat uses, still be capable of surviving independently if it needed to. Feral cat populations established themselves wherever domestic cats were released or escaped, from the Australian outback to the Galapagos Islands to the Scottish Highlands. These cats did not need to relearn how to be wild. The wildness was never fully removed. The feral cat situation across the world illustrates this point clearly. When domestic cats escape or are released into the wild, they do not struggle to survive. They hunt. They establish territories. They breed. Within a generation or two, feral cats behave in ways essentially indistinguishable from wild cats. The social behaviors that make house cats seek out humans fall away quickly when humans are not present, but the underlying wild cat behaviors were never gone. In Australia, where domestic cats arrived with European settlers and have since gone feral across the continent, they are now one of the most significant threats to native wildlife. Australian animals evolved without any felid predators, and feral cats have devastated populations of native birds, reptiles, and small mammals. The cats did not become a conservation crisis because they transformed into something new. They became one because they effortlessly reverted to what they already were. By the standard measures used to assess how much an animal has changed through domestication, the domestic cat ranks as the least transformed of all major domesticated species. Dogs changed enormously from wolves. Cattle, sheep, pigs, horses all changed substantially in both body and behavior over thousands of years of selective breeding. The cat changed almost not at all because no one was doing the selecting. The cats that ended up in human homes selected themselves, choosing the environment that suited them, and carrying nearly their entire wild genome into it intact. There is something worth sitting with in the conclusion of this comparison. Scientists went into it expecting to find a clear ancestor, and they found one. But the process of finding it revealed how precise the answer was. Not just the Near Eastern wildcat as a broad category, but a specific population from a specific geography at a specific moment in time. The DNA acted like a timestamp. It recorded not only which animal was the ancestor, but roughly when the relationship began, how many individuals founded the domestic population, and how the descendants spread from there. 10,000 years of cat history, encoded in the genome of every tabby sleeping on every couch on Earth right now. One wild cat. One region. One moment in history when grain stores and rodents and a particular small sandy-colored predator ended up in the same place at the same time. The comparison of every wild cat species on Earth to the domestic cat produced a single answer, and that answer turned out to be a precise address: the farming villages of the ancient Fertile Crescent, 10,000 years ago, where 5 female wildcats made a set of choices that resulted in 600 million of their descendants living in human homes today.